if I told you that a good reason to go to law school was that when you got out, you could go to a third world country, embed yourself with its poorest citizens, find the most egregious act of environmental damage, blame that act on a long since removed American oil company, and sue that company for $16 billion, in which you would get 1/3 of the award. You would think that law school was a pretty good place to go, and that a law degree was a worthy thing to have. Well, right at about this time, that's the process that Steve Donziger is on. Steve Donziger is someone I've talked about before. He's become the focus of our investigation of Chevron's involvement in Ecuador. What one of our writers, Robert Belker, has found and has written extensively about is how Mr. Donziger is at the center of what essentially has become a kind of shakedown of Chevron to get billions of dollars, primarily for himself, and allegedly, he says, to clean up Ecuador and help its poor citizens. But here's the problem. The real organization that is to be blamed for the 3.2 million barrels of oil that have been spilled since 1990 is none other than the state-owned Petroecuador. Petroecuador was created in 1989 and is the result of an original company which was 1/3 American and mostly Ecuadorian at a time when Ecuador was just getting into the oil business in the 60s and was helped by Texaco, which later became Chevron. 1990 saw the establishment of all oil production functions under the control of the government of Ecuador and in the form of the then new Petroecuador. But that began a long and nearly unbroken string of explosions and oil spills, all of which were the responsibility of Petroecuador. During this time, Chevron has attempted to distance itself from the unsafe actions of Petroecuador, most recently by seeking an injunction in court in New York, which was blocked by the state of Ecuador. Through this time, Steve Donziger has worked 14 years for the ability to take home a multi-billion-dollar paycheck at the hands of Chevron, because he alleges that the environmental damage that is there today is a responsibility of Chevron. The problem is that Chevron Texaco had long ago paid for its obligation to the environmental problems there and turned over its operation to Petroecuador. Mr. Donziger does not ever once point the finger at Petroecuador, yet he has embedded himself in the culture and given the people in those very poorest areas of Ecuador reason to hope for something that, in point of fact, may never come to pass for several reasons. The first of which is that there are no guarantees that, should Mr. Donziger win the lawsuit, that money will eventually go to the people for who need it most. Why? 1/3 of that is destined to go into Mr. Donziger's pocket by his own admission. Donziger has brazenly stated that such an enormous award is incentive for other law firms to come into that region and file similar lawsuits. In other words, if you're an attorney and you need some work that's going to pay you billions, come on down to Central America, find environmental damage, try to attach it to an American oil company, and then shake them for billions so that you can get rich. At the end of the day, who wins from this? Well, in point of fact, no one. Not the oil companies like Chevron, for which in this case, because they're large, are assumed to have done something bad when in point of fact they have not. Not Petroecuador, because Petroecuador gets off scot-free from this, And if they win the lawsuit, there's no guarantee that they're going to take that money and actually use it to clean up the regions of Ecuador that need it the most, to essentially clean up the spills and damages that Petroecuador have caused. Donziger doesn't win because if he loses the lawsuit, a lot of people in Ecuador will be upset with him. And if he wins the lawsuit, there may be people who will think that at some point along the way he did something unethical. But the biggest loser in all of this are the poor of Ecuador. Because right now they're being used as pawns in a giant game. A game that, if it turns out a certain way, could make one man one of the richest people in the world.